we need to be worried, first of all, about what the AI that's currently working, about the ethical problems it leads to. And they are very scary. And the one that scares people most is deception. We thought that when Christianity had been removed from the scene, atheism would take over. That's not true. Polytheism has taken over. Every person has their own God or is their own God. And now we live in an age where there's a distinct danger of artificial intelligence being treated as God. Remember that God, in his wisdom, has coupled intelligence with consciousness. Now, people talk about creating a conscious machine, but I say, what is consciousness? Nobody has the least idea.
Professor John Lennox is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's debated and defended Christianity around the world against its critics, including Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, and the late Christopher Hitchens. We've spoken before. In fact, one of my conversations with John about artificial intelligence, the world in general, and the place for Christian faith has been an extraordinarily popular recording that's now, I think, been viewed nearly 2 million times. So, John, it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you again. I'm a great admirer of yours, and I'm enjoying very much being with you and having this opportunity to talk again.
No, thank you very much, John. It's always a pleasure to chat to you because you come up with such intriguing questions that I am simply delighted to roll about in my mind. So welcome to Oxford.
Well, it's great to be here, I have to say. So to sort of kick it off, I noticed you've been talking to Jordan Peterson, and he's, I think, done us all a great service. He's got us talking about things that matter again, opened up subjects that were closed. But having said that, he's come to see a close connection between Christianity and science. Rather than seeing the two as being hostile to each other, it seems that he's suggesting that there's a change underway in terms of the old Christianity versus science debate. I suspect you have a similar view.
I think that's true. It's interesting. The French have now got a word for it, le grand renversement, the great reversal. And they're talking about it, which is quite remarkable for the French thinkers on the continent to be talking about a change in it. Well, I think that what's happening to Jordan, if I might put it this way, is he's come into contact with history. Because anyone that looks at the history of the relationship between science and religion will be aware, I would have thought, that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the pioneers, certainly in this part of the world of science, starting, say, with Galileo, and then you've got Kepler, Newton, and so on, were all Christians, essentially. And I've been interested in this for years. I came across this fact as a schoolboy. It was drawn to my attention by someone who really led me into this whole field, R.E.D. Clark of Cambridge. And the best summary of the situation, which I think Jordan Peterson has now grasped, is by C.S. Lewis. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So there's a very close consilience between a true science and true religion, as I would put it. And I'm delighted to see a number of thinkers coming to that kind of conclusion, like Peterson with science and religion, and like people like Tom Holland with history and understanding the influence of the Judeo-Christian worldview on our entire culture, our ethics, our institutions, and so on. I think something is happening that I welcome.
I agree with you. And in part, this conversation I'd like to dedicate to those good people who are noting that many intellectual and thought leaders who seemed so committed to an atheistic worldview only recently, have now started to move. Something is happening.
Yes.
But I suspect there are a lot of good people out there who said, well, we thought all these bright people were saying Christianity's dead, don't go there, it's superstitious, it's nonsense. Now they're saying we're revisiting our thinking. Where does that leave us? I think there are a lot of people, because we were talking this morning in a different context with Justin Briley about that slogan that was on the buses a few years ago.
Oh, yes.
God.
Yeah.
He's probably not there, so go and enjoy yourself,
yes.
which always seemed to be ridiculous for me. They weren't able to say he's not there, so that ought to immediately make you think, perhaps he is, I'd better investigate this.
Yes.
But the second point is we've been living as though God doesn't exist, and it's not working. It's not playing out very well.
It's not.
So we've got a lot of people, I would think, who are listening and thinking, how do I work this through?
Well, I think, you're in a position, and so am I to a certain extent, helping them to think it through. But it's important to recognize it. I think one of the clearest examples of what's going on is Hirsi Ali, who started in Somalia as a girl, grew up in a Muslim environment. Then they went to Holland. She was very bright in the Dutch educational system, ended up an MP, and then joined the Richard Dawkins New Atheist clan, until we hear that last November or so, she is declaring herself as a Christian. Now, what was very interesting about that was the interview that was organized and has been broadcast between Dawkins and her. And Dawkins approaches and says, you're not really a Christian. You haven't become a Christian. It's all baloney, you see. And by the time the interview is ended, he said, you are a Christian, but it's still all baloney. And I thought the way she described her transition is something very interesting that I would like to pursue, because what she said was, I choose to believe that Christianity is true. Now, she was against him piling in, there's no evidence for these things and all this kind of thing. She's feeling her way forward to a position of certainty. But it was very interesting to put it that way, I choose to believe. And I think she'd probably be a beacon light for a lot of people, because she has created quite a stir, to say the least.
I agree. Now back to this question of atheism and Christianity. C.S. Lewis, you mentioned him, more recently Alvin Plantinga, they've said that the real tension is not between science and Christianity. It's actually between science and atheism.
Yes.
That's sort of turning it on its head. What's the idea behind the idea that science and atheism are
Well, I
actually
subscribe to that. I think it's absolutely right. And that is the way I formulate it, because it really gets to people. They see that I'm saying something, that there is a real conflict out there. But actually, it is between science and atheism. And one of the ways that I approach that is the way that actually was developed by Lewis and Plantinga, but it goes back a long way. And that is the notion that what do we do science with? And I have fun with many colleagues or people I meet. I ask them, scientists, what do you do science with? And they say, well, I do it with and they're about to say mind when they realize that it's not politically correct to believe in the mind as distinct from the brain. So they say, I do it with my brain. So I say, tell me the brief history of the brain. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I just look at them and smile and say, and you trust it? And that creates a problem.
Yeah.
Because I actually push it, and I pushed it with quite a few scientists. They've all given me the same answer. I said, look, let's face it. In your lab tomorrow, you'll be using your computer. If you knew it was the result of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And the answer has always been, no, I would not. Well, I said, you have a problem. Your understanding of the genesis of the brain is conflicting with your whole understanding of the way in which science works. And I put it quite bluntly. I say, it's serious enough to shoot yourself in the foot. That's painful. But to shoot yourself in the brain is fatal. And I think that is an argument that has been picked up. And Lewis, he put it a slightly different way. He said, you cannot have an argument that says that arguments are invalid. And that's really what you're trying to say here. You're undermining rationality. So you're not only undermining science, you're undermining any argument whatsoever. And therefore, it seems to me that Plantinga's right, Lewis is right, and people have a problem. And it's a huge problem because it results from assuming that a naturalistic interpretation of nature is the only possible one. To allow God in, or to allow something non-natural in, would be heresy. So I commit heresy all the time, but it seems to me that people are beginning to grasp the point because they're fed up with materialism for other reasons.
It's an interesting observation, isn't it? That it isn't enough. That's what Hirsi said. She needed more.
Yes, there must be something more. Mm. And I fasten on that with people. And you can list a number of these people. You've mentioned Jordan Peterson as another, Tom Holland is another. There must be something more. And that, to my mind, is a very good start to build on in the conversation. What is this something more? That's the next question. But the fact that there must be something more is a very big step out of the mess we've got ourselves in by simply submitting ourselves culturally, academically, to a purely materialistic worldview.
I find myself wondering why we ever thought we could put down the quest for truth. See, our young people now go through universities where they're basically told there is no truth. It's all relative, it's all situational. But instinctively, I think we know that the pursuit of truth is important. And of course, in the end, from a Christian perspective, we believe that truth turns out ultimately to be a person.
That's right. Well, it's silly to tell people there's no such thing as truth. For the very obvious logical reason that you're stating that as a truth.
Yes.
and that is just foolishness. Oh. And I would want to maintain that there's nobody that believes that there's no such thing as truth. We all recognize truth. Ask a bunch of people that say there's no truth to come to a meeting at 7:00 and they'll all be there because they believe the truth that the meeting's at 7:00. This kind of foolishness, I think, needs to be called out for what it is. Now, there are people who are relativist in terms of ethics, which is a slightly different thing. A friend of mine once said, and I think he's right, people usually say that they're postmodern and post-truth in areas that they don't hold to be important. But in any area they hold to be important, they believe in truth.
Yeah.
Accuse them of crime and you see what happens.
Yes.
They'll believe in truth, all right, that they're innocent. And I think sometimes it needs to be called out in that simple way because it's just a nonsense. And you're absolutely right. Ultimate truth is not a proposition. It is a person. And when Jesus said, I am the truth, he was not merely saying, I say true things, although that is true. He was saying that if you keep questioning, it doesn't go back forever. It stops with him. That's a huge claim, but I think we need to bring it back into the foreground because it's the only thing that makes sense.
And because nothing's making sense anymore, we've ended up being, despite our material well-being, so very unhappy, so anxious,
desperately
so depressed.
Unhappy. The anxious generation.
Yeah. And you would see it you've had a lifetime of interacting with younger people. So you've seen the generations go through university. Do you see now a greater openness amongst young people to perhaps revisiting these things?
Oh, yes. Oh, I think so.
Do you?
I mean, I'm always a bit aware, John, a bit leery of generalizations.
Yeah.
Because these are
Being
impressions.
a mathematician.
They're subjective impressions, but nevertheless, I think there is a greater openness. And seeing the work of some of my younger friends around here who are excellent and thoughtful evangelists to young people, the response level, I feel, is really growing. That young people want to hear something that's solid. They have no orientation in life. They have no ultimate sense of meaning and purpose. And that perhaps is a bigger question currently than questions of relationship between God and science, although those are still important and relevant. The whole question of what does my life mean?
What is my identity?
Yes. And that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that you yourself have said, and I quote, "We can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but we cannot talk about the scientific foundation of ethics." That seems to me to be an important.
That was a much greater brain than mine. That was Albert Einstein.
Oh, really?
Yes, that was Einstein.
I didn't know that.
And the reason I quote that is simply to show that great scientists realize that science is limited. And that's a hugely important thing. Richard Feynman, who also won the Nobel Prize in the States, he said almost the same thing. And it's hugely important. I think perhaps the best way of putting it is by someone who unusually is a hero of both Richard Dawkins and mine, and that's Sir Peter Medawar, who worked here. And he said, look, I'm paraphrasing, it's very easy to see that the natural sciences are limited. They cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of my life? And that's absolutely right. They can't. And it's relatively easy to illustrate that. And there's a very interesting statement by a scientist, E.O. Wilson, brilliant entomologist, that he made, I think in 2009, where he said, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it's very dangerous.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say that until we answer the great questions that the philosophers used to deal with, he's not quite right on this, used to deal with, like, where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? We're on very thin ground. And he's seeing something, which I found very interesting for someone who's been a confirmed atheist for a long time. But that's absolutely right. Science is wonderful. It's given us all kinds of brilliant technology, but it's limited. And it can't answer the existential questions that are the most important questions.
As you say, I think there's something of a movement. People are saying, well, empty materialism isn't enough. And they may come to the point of saying, well, perhaps there's a higher being. Yes, I can accept the idea of God's reasonable, but there's more than that, surely. We need to know who he is.
Oh, yes, of course.
And then the problem becomes, people say, well, surely you don't believe that he personally reveals himself. Whereas I don't know that it's much use having a belief in God if you can't find out who he is.
Well, absolutely.
And that comes down to the question of whether or not the Bible has a place.
Yes, it does. But I often go in front of that to think about that unconscious assumption that revelation and reason are opposed to one another. And I say, and I use it to illustrate the previous thing, I talk about Aunt Matilda's cake. Now, Aunt Matilda's cake, I think, is something that is known by cricketers, but not this version of it. And that is, I imagine that she's made this cake and baked it. And she's very pleased with it. And we submit it to all Nobel Prize winners for analysis. And they give us physics, chemistry, biology, all of this. And we say, thank you very much for your 100-page treatises on this cake. And before you go, tell us why she made it. You physicists, well, I can't. I can tell you what it's made of, but not why she made it. In fact, none of them can tell us why she made it unless she reveals it. Now, it's good to think about revelation at the human level first, because when she reveals it by telling us, that doesn't shut our reason off. We use our reason to see if what she's talking about makes sense. So if she said, I've made it for my cousin Jane, and we know she has a cousin Jane, that makes perfect sense. And therefore, this argument that we get so much, the Bible claims to be revelation, but we believe in reason, that is a false apposition. You use reason on both methods of revelation that God has used, to bring it back to that. One is nature and the universe. The heavens declare the glory of God. You can read something off, but not a great deal, but that there is a God. But now, as to closer identification, God speaks and the Bible is a revelation, but it's not opposed to reason. We've got to use our reason even to read it and to understand it. And I think that's really important because of this apposition that's been forced on so many people. They think that once you use the revelation word, you have jumped over reason and you're negating it. No, you're not.
There's a very formidable, intellectually formidable Alex O'Connor.
Yes.
And he's an atheist, of course. He's pointed out that some contemporary thinkers who've praised Christianity of late, or at least softened in their opposition to it, so that would include even Richard Dawkins, I think, but certainly people, well, he softened in his opposition.
Well, he's calling himself a cultural Christian.
Yeah.
But cultural Christianity, enjoying singing Christmas carols at evensong and so on.
Well, that's the point, really.
But denying and still mocking the doctrines.
Yeah.
And that's the serious bit. He does not believe in the truth and rejects it. So if he wants to soften people's reaction to it, I think it's cheating, really, because he is not a believer.
Well, no, that leads to the point that I think that O'Connor is making as a fellow atheist, that the core teachings of Christianity are highly implausible and therefore very hard to believe. And it comes back to this question of why is it reasonable, or how is it that reasonable people can believe that the gospel is the truth?
Well, let's take one example. The first one that comes into my head that fits your context, I think. If you take Tom Holland, starting off as an atheist, brilliant historian, reading the ancient world and believing, to start with, that all our cultural values came from either Greece or Rome. But he starts reading more carefully. And now he comes to the conclusion that they're not from Greece or Rome. They're from the Judeo-Christian tradition. But he goes further than that. He said at the heart of that tradition, and it's actually a very moving passage where he describes his discovery of the meaning of the cross of Christ at the center of this. And the basic gospel, he said, something so strange and so against any concept either of Greece or Rome as anything that could possibly yield something positive, nevertheless lies at the heart of the gospel that Paul preached. And the passage where he describes that, I found incredibly moving. So I think there is an example where he's coming to discover that actually the message, when you look at it, seems to be weak and miserable and all the rest of it, but it deals with the fundamental human problem of guilt. And if I might call it sin, which no utopia deals with, which is why they all fail. And it seems to me that Tom's discovery of this is hugely important if we can grasp that actually there's sense to it when you look at it carefully, that this message that was condemned from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, nevertheless turned out to be, and I quote Paul, the power of God unto salvation, because it offered people something that they'd never been offered before. And that was a sense of forgiveness, a sense of identity in relation to God who created them in his own image. And all of that comes up all together. And I think that that is something well worth pursuing. What are the roots of even our institutions, our education? Here we sit in Oxford. What's its logo? Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my light. And it was very interesting listening to the psychiatrist, who's another one of these people who seems to be moving. Ian McGilchrist?
Yes. I've had a conversation with him recently.
Did you?
Talking about the left and right hemispheres of the brain.
Absolutely. Well, that is fascinating stuff. Now, Ian, of course, I've had a conversation with him, but I've read his book, The Big One.
Yeah.
Is utterly fascinating because it seems to be that what he's turned up with is a left-brained solution to the demolition of materialism. But he understandably doesn't like anything that involves doctrine, because doctrine smacks of the left brain and he wants to move to the right brain. And I want to say you need both, which he at other places
himself acknowledges that.
What?
He acknowledges that.
Oh, yes, he does.
At one level.
Yeah, at one level.
Because he says the high points in human history have been the times when left and right have been in appropriate balance.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. Oh. But he's another of these thinkers, absolutely remarkable thinker.
I wouldn't want to misunderstand what he was saying to me, but my impression was he was saying that at the very least, the search for truth, the search for the sacred, the attempt to find something greater is critical if you to make your way in life.
Yes, he said the hardest chapter in his book to write was the book about the sacred. Yeah. And he said explicitly, we must make room for God. But he was in Oxford not long ago. And he gave a lecture where he mentioned the logo of the university, just in his last few words, and pointed out that this is what we need to get back to. It was a stunning end to what he was saying. I found him extremely interesting. And here we are, another person who is finding hard evidence that there is something more. And his quantification of it in terms of the left and right hemispheres and the way they communicate, of course, is absolutely fascinating. And his analysis of culture and history, that for centuries, recent centuries, we have so allowed the left side of the brain to dominate that we've all ended up in materialism and we know the value of everything and the meaning of nothing.
Yes. Now, back to something you were saying that I really want to pick up on. The alternative belief systems, for want of a better word, including the Enlightenment,
yes,
have not really given us a capacity to cope with guilt and the need for forgiveness.
No.
They don't. Well, the Enlightenment, I think the underlying assumption is that if we're sufficiently enlightened, we won't have problems with guilt because we'll be good. But that's not the way it is. So we've stopped doing an understanding of guilt. We've decried the need for forgiveness. Now we find, I think many people are looking for forgiveness, conscious that there are problems in their life, but we live in a culture that's forgotten the importance of forgiveness and how to do it.
I think that's absolutely right, except in certain extreme cases like genocide and so on, where we have the truth and reconciliation committees and all that kind of, where there've been extreme violence and all this kind of thing. But on the general level of people, they have a sense of guilt and they don't know what to do with it. And I think the current confusion and lack of orientation, there's no compass needle to point you anywhere, has left a huge emptiness. I was very interested in reading a quotation from an economist. Deepak Lai, I think is his name. And he is saying, yes, I now know where it was. Douglas Murray quoted him. Deepak Lai said, we thought that when Christianity had been removed from the scene, atheism would take over. And he said, that's not true. Polytheism has taken over.
Yes.
Every person has their own God or is their own God. And now we live in an age where there's a distinct danger of artificial intelligence being treated as God. And we're in such a mess. Just apropos of nothing in particular, but again, Douglas Murray, something really captured my attention, that in a schools board in California, they got the children praying to an Aztec god. And the Aztec god, there are 20 prayers, and these children, it was mandatory that they repeat these prayers for their own benefit, and they're to a god that demanded human sacrifice. And that is documented. And Murray is saying, this is where this business is going.
Just when you think you've heard it all, along comes another story out of California.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is terrifying.
Oh, it is. I couldn't agree with you more. Now, to come back, though, you just made the comment then, that in many ways, young people have been encouraged to believe in themselves. You're God over yourself. You own your own body. You own your own destiny. Yes. Even to the extent, it seems to me, that there won't be some God out there who tells me whether I'm man or woman. I'll decide. The problem with being your own God, I would have thought, and I think it's producing a massive amount of misery. I'm testing a theory of mine here with you, is actually tied up with this idea that we're not up to the task of being God, because the very way we're wired, we're aware that we're not actually godlike, that we're flawed, that there are failings. But you can't pass judgment on yourself if you're your own God. You see, you have to be perfect. So it must be somebody else's fault.
Yes.
And I think this is leading to this problem, this deep need. It's in denial of the need to come to grips with your own failings, your own sinfulness,
because
and to seek forgiveness and redemption.
You haven't any source. What you've said reminds me of Nietzsche's famous statement, if there were a God, I couldn't bear it not to be he.
Yes.
And that's a very profound statement. People, in the classical world, it goes back almost to the tension, if you could look at it that way, between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That you had Plato and Socrates, saying that all we need is education, and that will sort us out. We just need to get our heads in the right space and we'll be good. And Aristotle, very much like the Apostle Paul, said, no, I know all that, but I don't have any power to be good. And we have this capacity for self-analysis that leads us to be miserable, but we've no power, no solution. And one of the dangers, I think, of the contemporary world is we have this endless palette of gurus giving us 5 or 6 laws or 10 or however many we need. And that's all well and good, but they don't give us the power. And so that misinterpreted and taken the wrong way, which is really the intention of the people that lay them down, can make us more miserable still, because we can't keep these laws. And for someone to come along and tell us, no, you can't keep these laws because there's a fundamental flaw, and I want to give you the diagnosis of it, that is too radical for many people. But they're beginning to wonder whether there just might be something in that.
Let's hope so. And certainly you and I know, would want to encourage people to explore, to think, follow this through. Leads me to a question that's often troubled me. And it's this. What do you say to somebody who says, I'd like to believe, I want to believe what you believe, but I just can't? Because that seems to me to be where Alex O'Connor is at.
Yes. Well, I hesitate in trying to answer that, because what do you say to someone is a generic question. And It depends entirely, as you know, who that someone is, where they're coming from. And I want to ask a whole lot of questions before I would attempt any answer to that. What is it they can't believe? Let's start with some, and spend time talking to them about what it is that they cannot believe. And often in that kind of situation, it comes from, well, David Hume taught us that the miracles are impossible because we know the laws of nature. Well, you can solve that kind of problem intellectually very easily, I think. Lewis solved it long ago, but people don't listen to him. But it may be something else. They can't believe it because it would mean too radical a change in their lifestyle, because it cuts at who they know they are, and they don't want any change. So they put up this barrier. And I feel I want to take everybody seriously. And if they put up a question, I take it seriously. But the motivation behind the question can be wildly different, and the statement. So I'm at a loss as to how to know to answer that.
Well, no, I think what you said is actually very helpful, because it recognises the reality that there could be any one of a number of reasons.
Yes.
Some of which the person might be owning and some of which they're in denial about.
Yes, that's right.
Often the presentation will be, I can't believe in a God who allows suffering.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think you hit, of course, on the hardest question.
Yeah.
This is clearly the hardest question. And it's the hardest question for any worldview.
Yes.
And, you know, some years ago, I was in New Zealand, and I got there 2 days after the earthquake. And it was very interesting talking to people, the range of ways in which they tried to cope with it. Some people saying bravely that even though the wind and the sea rage, I won't be moved, quoting one of the Psalms. Other people saying, well, it's their karma and hard luck on them, but don't help even the survivors because you're making it more difficult for them in the life to come. And other people say, well, there you go. Isn't it evident that there is no God at all? Suffering and pain are the hardest things, I think, that certainly I find to deal with. And I find it helpful, though, to observe that there are two perceptional standpoints on pain and suffering. There's the person who's suffering, their perception of it. And there's a person that watches that suffering. It's very different. A cancer doctor sees the young woman's cancer very differently from the way in which she sees it. So there's the participant and there's the observer, and we need to separate them. And then, of course, there are at least two potential sources of it. There's the suffering that people do to one another.
Yes.
And then there's the earthquakes, tsunamis, cancers, all that kind of thing. And we need to tease them apart. But it interests me that those that go down the atheist route, they claim to have solved the problem in saying that there is no God. But if you notice what's happening here, they may have satisfied themselves that they solved the problem. They've removed the problem, but simultaneously, as I pointed out to a number of people in New Zealand, amongst other places, that they've removed all hope by definition. And therefore, there's an unsatisfactory thing there, because human nature cries out in all of this for justice. And I want to ask the question where it comes from. You see, if there is no God, why should we bother about suffering? It's just like the world is. And Dawkins almost takes that position, you know.
Oh, he does?
Yes.
It's a very heartless position in the end.
It's utterly heartless.
Because you see, it means, apart from anything else, there's no explanation for it. It's just random. It's just accidental. Well, why does it hurt so much? The other problem with it is, it seems to me, we at least, if we believe, and I certainly do, and you do, have the knowledge that it wasn't meant to be.
No.
And that one day the wounds will be bound up. There's a hope.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. But in between, I think there's something we can say. And that is, as I have put it to many people, that at the heart of Christianity, whether you accept it or not, perhaps you should just listen to what it claims before you throw it out, is a God who suffered.
Yes.
And the central claim of Christianity is that the one on the cross was God. And you can ask then, what is God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, I want to argue, at the very least, he's not remaining distant from human suffering, but is becoming part of it. And there I see the window, because the cross, the claim is followed by the resurrection. And that's what gives me hope, that beyond the suffering, there is resurrection. So I can bring hope to the young woman who's been given 3 months to live because of cancer. I can't take the cancer away or the suffering, but I can bring hope. And that's where the difference is, that Christ offers us something. I often say, he doesn't compete with any other religion at all, because none of the others offer us this, a forgiveness and a hope for the future that doesn't depend on our own attempts to keep a given set of laws, but rather depend on what he's done, because we can't keep those laws.
Amen. One of the things that I think I've taken a long time to appreciate, it goes to the heart of this, that you've mentioned this, that God experiences suffering. He's not distant from it. But it's the extent of that suffering.
Yes.
It eclipses anything we've known. If you stop and think about it, utterly rejected, totally alone, when he's been falsely accused, and we all know how cutting it is to be falsely accused, subjected to an absolute sham of a legal process, knowing mental and spiritual agony and physical pain that is beyond our comprehension, crucifixion having been flogged within an inch of your life. So he knew he's not distant from suffering. It's taken me a long time to see, I think, in my life, my walk, or to even begin to try and comprehend how real his willingness to take that suffering on was. We can't say he doesn't understand.
No, we can't say he doesn't understand. And often in my experience pastorally, talking to people, when you get to that point, there's a dawning of awareness that this could mean something to me and could lift my burden. And that's the amazing thing. And once you come to the fact that God raised him from the dead, and that actually tells you that that suffering was way beyond mere human suffering. It did something that enables God to receive me and forgive me. That's big stuff when people begin to see it. And that's often when conversion begins, in my experience. So the hardest problem often becomes the gateway into a lifelong solution where people find the bedrock on which they can build their lives and not be afraid.
This is an important point. It's a very profound thing that you say this as a mathematician. You're saying to us as a scientist of enormous reach and standing that the resurrection is not only critically important, we can be confident that it actually happened. This really goes right back to the issue, doesn't it? That science, it's a very glib thing to say that science disproves God.
I know.
When someone of your standing, don't be embarrassed, says, yes, I believe the resurrection actually happened.
And I want to stand by it in the sense that many people in my position use the argument that they used. I can't believe that. And when you say, why can't you? Well, David Hume, centuries ago, he showed that miracles violate the laws of nature, and therefore, end of story. You can't come to me with a resurrection story. And I say to them, just a minute. You're confusing categories, which actually Hume confused very badly. And I have that from the greatest interpreter of Hume, the philosopher in Reading, who wrote many books on Hume and was really one of the great atheists of his day, whose name I've forgotten just for the moment. It'll probably come back. But in high old age, he came to believe there was a God and wrote about it. And the simple thing is, Lewis pointed it out long ago, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's one of those arguments I wish I'd thought of. That this notion of violating laws of nature is not what occurred at the resurrection. You see, violating laws is legal language. But you see, the laws of nature are not legal things at all. They're our descriptions of what normally happens. Let me give you an example. If I have a ball here and drop it, Newton's law of gravitation will say it falls towards the center of the earth. That doesn't stop you reaching out and catching it. Because the circumstances have now changed, something has intervened. It doesn't break Newton's law. It simply tells me that something else must have come in. And Lewis has got this wonderful story. So suppose I'm staying in London overnight, a couple of nights stay, and I place £100 in the drawer on a Friday night. They do the same on Saturday night. So 100 plus 100 is 200. Then on Sunday morning, I wake up, open the drawer, and there's only £50 in it. Now, what do I say? Do I say the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? And Lewis's point is, I say the laws of England have been broken. How do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's very simple, but it's very powerful and shrewd. In other words, the fact that I know that the laws of arithmetic say 100 plus 100 equals 200, under normal circumstances, unless somebody puts their hand into the drawer. So my mistake was to think that the system of the bedroom, the drawer, was a closed system of cause and effect. And what I've discovered to my pain is it wasn't. I've lost 150 quid. And Lewis then ramps that up onto the scale of the universe and says that when God feeds a new event into nature, it doesn't break any laws. When God turns water into wine, it'll make you drunk if you drink too much of it, according to the law of nature. But it's the resurrection is not the ordinary laws of nature working and pushing Christ out from the tomb. No, it's God feeding a new event in. His power comes into what is not a closed system, but an open system. God designed the universe, and here comes the irony of the whole thing. If we didn't know how the universe normally worked, we'd never recognize a miracle if we saw one.
Yeah.
We need to know the laws. So a Christian like me doesn't deny the laws of nature. I rejoice in them. I used to enjoy teaching Newton's law and how you deduce the shape of the planetary orbits from it and all the rest of it. I loved it. But the point is that God, having created a universe to work that way, is perfectly at liberty to feed a new event in. And that's what he did when he, by his power, raised Jesus from the dead. We often talk about the resurrection of Jesus, but actually what Scripture says is he was raised from the dead. There's the active ingredient of God's power coming in from outside. And so I say to people, science has nothing to say against that whatsoever. So I can accept that. Provided that now we've got over the in-principle argument that miracles cannot happen because science forbids them, then you come to the next question, which is the historical question: is there any evidence that one did happen? And that brings you, of course, to the historical evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, which most of us have investigated many times in our lives and done the forensic type of analysis that brings you to the sense that it is by far the best explanation of what the facts about it are. But that's a big discussion, as you know.
Important one. But for now, the last time you and I talked, I think you made the point very powerfully. I've never heard it put more eloquently. I'll see if I can summarize it. That instinctively we seek for immortality.
Yes.
It's actually provided for us because we can share in that resurrection.
Yes.
But we go looking for it in all sorts of other ways, including transhumanism.
Yes, right.
Which you've described as yet another dangerous pursuit of immortality in a way that's not likely to work, as I understand it.
Yes.
I'd just like to go back to that for a moment. Just recap. Transhumanism, what is it?
Well, transhumanism is the view that we are going to, by our brain power, engineering, everything else, move humans up a stage and really into what is better described as a post-human stage. And there are all kinds of scenarios, either that we enhance human beings by implants, by adding to them various mechanical devices, biological devices, all the rest of it, so that we actually, in the end, according to some scenarios, merge with the machines and we become superhuman entities with vastly greater intelligence and potential and all this kind of thing.
And we do away with feelings of sadness or depression.
Oh yes, we conquer. Well, the first thing that Harari is one of the main people driving this. Yuval Noah Harari is not a scientist, he's a historian, but he has got a lot of leverage because he's influences the public a lot in his book Homo Deus. And quite frankly, what he's trying to do, or trying to suggest we do, is turn humans from beasts into gods. And he thinks that can be done.
The search for immortality.
It's a search for immortality. But when I meet people like that, and they lay out this program for me, I just say, you're too late. And that puzzles them. They say, we haven't got there yet. How could we be too late? I say, but look, the problem of physical death was solved 20 centuries ago when Jesus was raised from the dead. It was actually solved earlier than that when he raised someone from the dead. And as for transhuman uploading and all the rest of it, well, the greatest uploading is going to come when Christ returns and speaks, and all those who believe in him will be taken up from the grave and live permanently with him in a new world which will absolutely outshine any conceivable utopia you've ever thought of, because it will be on a moral basis. So that it seems, therefore, to me that transhumanism, that desire for immortality is pushing back the pages of history back to you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, if you disobey God. And the key answer to that is no. The way to transcend, if you like, all the problems of this life is to obey God and his word. And you will discover there the secret of eternal life. So it's a parody of the Christian message. And that's why it's so attractive. It's so near the truth. We'll turn you into gods. Well, people are attracted by that. And, you know, some of these very wealthy people have frozen their brains and their bodies in the hope that we'll have solved this problem in a few years. Before the ice runs out on the freezing mechanism, so that they can be uploaded into some permanent eternal state. And they don't see that this is being offered to them. And the big difference is that the Christian message is a message of two things, not one. It's repentance. Face the mess we've made of our own lives first, and the mess, sadly, that we may have made of other people's lives, and bring that to God, who is prepared to forgive us if we face it and trust him. And why should we trust him? Well, the evidence is there.
Now, since you and I last spoke, this whole debate has probably been moved on a long way by the extraordinary developments in AI. And what looks like, on the one hand, an almost limitless possibility for developing artificial intelligence way beyond the simple, if multifactored sort of intelligence that we were talking about a couple of years ago, to perhaps even genuine artificial intelligence. But more than that, I think we're truly frightened too by where this might end up. Where do you see, since we last talked over the last couple of years, the whole AI thing has gone and is going?
Yes, well, because of that extremely rapid, accelerated development, I've actually written a new book, which in a sense replaces 2084. It's twice as long, which rather indicates that in the past 4 years, things have changed, and there are really scary things about it. I think this would be the beginning of another conversation, really. But one of the main issues, I think, is to realize what someone said recently was we need to be worried, first of all, about what the AI that's currently working, about the ethical problems it leads to. And they are very scary. And the one that scares people most is deception. Now, this is what I'm talking about here, are deepfakes.
Yes.
And you, as a former politician, will know how risky that is. And here we are in 2024, when roughly half the world is going to the vote in elections of one kind or another. The potential of that is so scary that the Five Eyes, that is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, and USA, their top security people have been discussing this. And it's very interesting that the thing that worries them most is deepfake impersonation. And quoting one of them, billions of people will have no idea what the truth is. Now, that is serious stuff.
Yes.
And that concerns me, because that's the world that my grandchildren are going to grow up in, and yours too. And it is really scary. And that is not the sci-fi stuff of creating a super intelligence, whether that ever happens or not. There's no sign of it yet. That's the stuff that we are already deploying. And I just am amazed reading the Douglas Murray's book, War on the West, that here in the West, we're decrying ourselves and doing ourselves down, and we're told to do that. You must respect every culture other than your own. There's no other culture in the world that's doing that.
No.
And that leads to a very dangerous situation, that where we criticize the human rights in China, among the Uyghurs, and the society of surveillance there is just terrifying what's happening. They just say, well, look, what about your own record? You yourselves are saying that you're rotten to the core historically. That is a very worrying development to my mind. And it's the stuff that's already working, let alone anything that could happen in the future, which I think is of less concern because it has a huge amount of speculation attached to it. Remember that God, in his wisdom, has coupled intelligence with consciousness. Now, people talk about creating a conscious machine, but I say, what is consciousness? Nobody has the least idea.
And whose consciousness?
Yes, they're talking hot air, quite frankly. We don't know what it is, which is an amazing thing. We all know that we're conscious, but what is consciousness? Well, if you don't know what it is, you're certainly not going to be able to build it. And there are lots of reasons for thinking that is likely to be logically impossible. But that's, again, another development. What has really, I think, alarmed me in the last 4 years is, first of all, the intrusion of surveillance technology and its sophistication. It is very sophisticated now. And the danger of the argument, you want peace and safety, will you give up your freedom? Which is being used frequently all over the place. And all the ethical problems created by narrow AI in that area of surveillance, but also in the quality of the impersonation stuff. I've had a deepfake made of me, and they showed it to me. It was so convincing, it was scary.
That is terrifying.
And it just costs a few dollars, to make. And what are our children being led into with many educational establishments full of all kinds of very strange, relativistic, woke, everything else notions, where truth is getting pushed to the edge. And you can believe what you like.
One aspect of this is even adds to my concern is I think it was one of the leading Five Eyes observers of this. You mentioned the 5 Eyes. I said that one of the great problems is that we might want to put some sensible limitations ourselves on AI.
Yes.
But if bad state actors don't, and if they develop technology which we're not able to match.
Yeah, so we've got to keep on developing it.
Yeah.
So we become bad actors potentially ourselves. The concept of a bad actor is a very interesting one. We used to call them evil people, but now they're bad actors.
Well, as you say, it's a whole new area of conversation and a very concerning one. So I would say this. I hope this conversation, for those who hear it, becomes a teaser, if you like, for your book. When's it due out?
It's due out in November.
Well, we'll look forward to it. John, you've been very generous with your time. Your insights are invaluable, and I salute you.
Well, thank you so much for such an interesting conversation, as always. John, thank you.
Keep well.
And you.